Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Historic Preservation Commission, we thank you for joining us for the presentation tonight of the Historic Resources Survey Plan. Members of the Historic Preservation Commission are Chairwoman Shannon Rogan, Vice Chair Jean Delicio, Commissioners Jana Remington and Elizabeth Kelly. And joining us tonight, we have a few members of the City Council, Karen Griego and Erin Ogletree. And Erin was one of the founding members on the commission, the Historic Preservation Commission. So we're glad they could join us. The city received a certified local government grant of $25,000 from History Colorado, who is the state historic preservation officer, to fund preparation of the survey plan, which will be utilized by the commission to guide future efforts to document and inventory the historic resources located within the city limits. Tom and Lori Simmons of Front Range Research Associates and Erica Warslow of Clear Story Preservation are the historians who prepared the plan for us. And I'll turn the meeting over to them to present their work. Tom?
Thank you very much, Georgie. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. I wish we could actually be there in person. We were just notified our first in-person meeting of this sort is going to be taking place in late July, so we look forward to getting back to more face-to-face type meetings. But hopefully this will work well. You never know what will happen, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. It's Lori and I would like to say it's been a great experience working on this project, especially since we did the 2001-2002 intensive survey of the core zone. We've been back in Trinidad in between, but it's really nice to get kind of look at it more intently and look at other areas of the city than just the central part. We want to thank Georgie for being a great partner on this project throughout the course of several months now. We'd also like to thank their staff members in city offices and the county, including Assessor Amato, that helped us with some of the parcel data that we needed in the survey. Also, we'd like to thank the residents and members of the HPC that provided us with suggestions on properties, areas, and themes for us to examine in developing the survey plan. And now Erica is going to discuss exactly what a survey plan consists of. We're not going to reiterate what everything we did last time, but this is just a brief kind of overview introduction.
Thanks, Tom. So my name is Erica Warzel. Thank you again for this project. It's been a real honor to be able to dive deeper into Trinidad and see its historic resources on the ground. So a survey plan is a document that helps the community know where do we go from here in terms of historic preservation plan. It identifies what work has been done in terms of surveys and designations, examines the city with the windshield survey, and makes recommendations concerning future survey efforts. This slide shows the steps that we've completed up to this final meeting at the bottom of the slide there. And as Georgie noted, this is a project that's been funded by a certified local government grant to the city of Trinidad from History Colorado. A survey of historic resources, which is a term we use to reflect not only historic buildings, but structures such as bridges, etc., documents what is there now, how it's changed over time, and whether it may be worthy of preservation, either as an individual property or part of this district that encompasses other properties of similar background. The information collected in the survey varies on the type of survey completed, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. But in general, the information that's collected and analyzed can help owners in the greater community have a better understanding of the history of the property, the neighborhood, and the city itself. This information can be used for promotional or educational materials. And the findings can also show what properties or districts are historically important and are eligible for designation as historic, which in turn can then be used to guide owner and community decisions on preservation. A historic building survey, as I mentioned, identifies properties that might be potentially eligible to either the National Register of Historic Places, State Register of Historic Properties, and or local designation through either the city or county. In Trinidad, we have a number of individually listed properties in addition to the Corazon Historic District. For example, the Emmerich House on Nevada Avenue at the top of the slide, and the McCormick House on Homeland Street at the bottom, which are both listed in the National Register. Designation has benefits, opportunities both to foster civic pride, but also for owners to take advantage of possible tax incentives and grant funding for preservation.
Thank you. And I have to say, when we were driving up in the northwest area up on Pinion, it was such a shock to come upon that the McCormick House up there. It was such a massive building in such a relatively remote area of the city. So that's what I mean by getting out in the periphery and discovering things like that. It was an interesting experience. So before we get to the discussion of the sub areas that we looked at, one of the other tasks in the project was to sort of do a gross re-examination of the Corazon National Register Historic District. And this is a very important part of the city because of its size and the fact that it embraces the commercial core. Essentially what we try to do is compare our findings from the 2001-2002 survey with how it is currently. And fundamentally, our base conclusion is the Corazon remains a very strong historic district. However, we did find some changes that were somewhat concerning. These include, especially this is the area north of Maine. The area south of Maine, I think, has relatively little changes observed in our windshield survey. But the area to the north, there were included, the changes included demolition of contributing buildings, erection of new buildings, which of course are not contributing, and changes to the setting. And some of the new construction includes some fairly large scale buildings, and especially along North Commercial on either side of North Commercial. In addition, some buildings have been so altered that they would now be assessed as not contributing. Next slide. The other thing we did are recommendations in regard to the Corazon. One of the main things we think is that there probably should be a revised National Register district nomination prepared. And for several reasons. One, the current period of significance for the district ends in 1924. The 1973 National Register nomination is an old nomination. It was really before you had to state a period of significance. And essentially the National Park Service inferred a period of significance that ended in 1924, which is way too early. I guess part of the reason too is the 50-year rule. Since it was the nomination was prepared in 1973, they picked a date 50 years before that date. But it does not, that 1924 date doesn't really capture the historical or architectural significance of the district. It also leads to many significant intact buildings being classified as non-contributing. And this is not like an academic question, a sort of inside baseball question. I mean, this has a very real impact on the ability of owners to get tax credits. Several large commercial and social buildings were erected in the mid to late 1920s. Also, a lot of very fine examples of automobile-related resources, including service stations and garages. So we think a reevaluation of the district should consider extending the ending date of the period of significance to at least 1950. That would capture, I think, a good bit of the historic build-out of the district. Such a study should also look at the district boundary. And I think one can kind of understand why the district boundary was drawn the way it was in 1973, because there hadn't been a lot of development in many years. I think it was probably a pipe dream of people to think that the area between the river and the existing downtown would fill up with much of construction. But that has not proven to be the case in more recent years. In other words, the larger boundary didn't really have an impact on the district when it was first created. Now some new construction has occurred, and more might be forthcoming. Each new building or other resource constructed in the district represents another non-contributing resource. When we did the survey in 2001-02, we thought the existing boundary was okay, but now we think it might be inappropriate to reconsider the district and maybe contract the boundary somewhat, and the study would indicate exactly how that would be done. Also, the current 1973 nomination really doesn't meet the requirements that's expected of National Register district nominations. The information from the earlier survey and some supplemental survey would help address that situation. The other point is that we think mandatory design review would be a good thing to look into because it would kind of force people to kind of take a look at what they might be proposing, and the HPC could perhaps suggest some alternatives that might be able to address an owner's desires without having as much of an impact as some of the development. Erica?
Thanks. So now we'll go on to our assessment of the sub-areas. We developed guidelines for undertaking the windshield survey with the main focus on areas that we thought were suitable for surveys, such as contiguous areas with strong clustering of historic resources that possess historic integrity. And by integrity, we mean how altered buildings within an area are. If there's lots of additions, porch alterations, material changes, and newer infill construction, that would have an impact on the integrity of the area. The last point on this slide addresses the general rule that in order to be considered historic, properties generally have to be at least 50 years old, unless extraordinary significance can be determined, which a windshield survey as a kind of overview isn't able to really dive into very well. So we kept it to areas that had been part of the city before 1976. At our December meeting, we reported that we had identified 9 sub-areas of the city for inspection in the windshield survey, which are shown here. We conducted the windshield survey itself in March of this year, driving the areas, taking selected photos, making notes. Our post-field work analysis ranked the areas as high, moderate, and low priority, with additional recommendations on the type of survey recommended to priority. So high on our priority list were CP Treat's Northside Addition, an area southeast of the Corazon Historic District, and the Trinidad State Junior College campus. Moderate areas were the Taylor and Robinson Addition of the north and Fisher's Peak to the south. The remaining 5 sub-areas were assessed as low priority. And we'll highlight these areas in the following slides. However, before we get into those areas, I'll just do a quick overview again of the types of survey reconnaissance and intensive. So here's a quick reminder about what that means. Reconnaissance survey forms are intended to include or be able to address more properties at once, but they collect a very limited amount of information, very little background research into the history of a property. Basic info is collected, such as notable features and likely changes based on observations, and multiple photos are taken. But because of this overview approach, the reconnaissance survey is seldom able to reach a conclusion on eligibility for designation. Because there is less work involved with the reconnaissance survey form, they do cost less to produce. Intensive survey forms are more complicated and therefore more expensive. They contain a fairly full history of a property, an architectural description, including all able to note changes that we're able to determine from observation and looking at historical documentation. And then based on that information, a recommendation on eligibility for designation. Location and sketch maps are included, and historical photos are sometimes included as well. They can be tracked down. And because of this higher effort for intensive, they do cost more to understand the process. So with that overview, we'll go over our recommendations for the future survey work in the city. As I mentioned before, one of the high priority areas for the survey in the future is CP Treat's Northside Addition, which is one of the largest residential additions to the city, which began to be built at least as early as 1879. Just over 2/3 of the addition's nearly 500 homes were built by 1915. The Management Survey revealed a high level of historic integrity within the additions, homes representing a wide range of architectural styles from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that reflect the growing prosperity of the city and its residents during this era. Styles include Milan, Mediterranean Revival, Dutch Colonial Revival, Tudor Revival, Pueblo Revival, and Craftsman. As such, the subdivision is recommended as a high priority for survey in order to document its historical development, its excellent examples of residential architecture, and possible potential for historic district designation. There are 2 houses within CP Treats that are already listed in the National Register. The 1925 Frank Latuda House on West Colorado Avenue, and the 1905 Altman House, also on West Colorado. We recommend that the survey area for CP Treats should be slightly smaller than the addition's flat boundaries due to some degradation of integrity of the homes and an infill at the northern boundary. We've also considered that the eastern boundary along Nevada is really becomes much more commercial in nature as you move further east. So we're recommending a boundary that captures more of the residential neighborhood itself. However, on the west side, we have recommended moving the boundary slightly to capture some historic buildings on that western edge that have high integrity. The total number of parcels within our recommended area for survey is 398. Due to the addition's wide range of styles and house sizes, as well as multiple spans of time represented in years of construction, we do recommend that the area should be comprehensively surveyed with a ratio of intensive to reconnaissance survey of 20 to 80, which is higher than the typical ratio of 10/90, which is usually recommended for large survey areas. It's important to note, because of this large area and the number of parcels to survey, it's likely that any future survey efforts would be best phased in order to address cost and time issues of surveying such a large area.
I would say too, on CP Treats, we were really impressed each of us looked at the areas the other team primarily looked at, and we were very impressed with the CP Treats. The other thing that kind of stands out for it is the landscape significance of the landscape median along Colorado Avenue, and also a little arm going up Alta, and that's an interesting thing for them to have done at that point. So that's another rationale, something that would be addressed in the historic context for that survey. So the second high priority area is the area southeast of the core zone, we looked at the entire area, and we essentially determined that a good part of the area really lacked the necessary location for a survey effort. The area contains pockets of contributing buildings throughout, but these are interspersed with areas of greatly altered dwellings and newer construction. There are a number of Trinidad Housing Authority developments here, including isolated units and full block projects. A potential survey area was identified southeast of the core zone containing 46 questions. And I'll point out, sometimes the tables that we're showing for each of these areas don't add up to the total number of parcels we're saying, because in the tables, because of the way the assessor collects the data, some of the parcels don't have attribute data, therefore they don't show up. They don't provide year builds that we can include in the tables. Now, this area is residential in character. And about 84% of the dwellings were constructed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. More than half were built between 1900 and 1915. And they kind of reflect the architectural styles that you would expect in that period. The eastern part also features brick streets, which in the report we really emphasize the important character-defining nature of the brick streets of Trinidad, and we're glad to see that the city funded a study of how to maintain and keep those streets in good repair. The area southeast of the core zone contains large and small scale dwellings from 1 story to 2.5 stories. So there's a good bit of variation. The architectural styles and building forms include craftsman, four-square, Queen Anne, Edwardian, bungalow, and classic cottage. Next slide. The blue line shows the suggested survey area. And again, the recommended survey approach is the same as that discussed earlier for CP treats, a ratio of 20/80 intensive to reconnaissance survey forms for the same reasons that Erica articulated for CP treats. Next. We were really very impressed with the campus of Trinidad State Junior College. And again, this might be a project that perhaps the city wouldn't want to undertake. Maybe the college itself would like to do a reassessment of its buildings. Some of the buildings on the campus were surveyed in 2001, at a time when many of them were not yet 50 years old. So I think the survey kind of gave a lot of the buildings short shrift because they didn't meet the 50-year National Register rule. Classes began at Trinidad State Junior College in 1926. Depression-era public works projects added buildings, and there's a great deal of growth in the post-World War II era, with lots of expansion, especially in the 1960s and also in the 1970s. The hilly terrain, landscaping, and curving walkways add interest to the campus. I don't want to push this comparison too far, but I've been to Lehigh University on a visit, and the use of the terrain and the curving roads and the way the buildings are placed reminded me a good bit of that campus. And it has, especially in postmodern, it appears to us to be fairly intact as a representative, especially of post-World War II buildings. And the other thing that the previous survey did not do is really get into digging into who the architects were, who the buildings were, and that is something a new survey could do. Next slide. So today, nearly all the college buildings are more than 50 years old, and the 15 campus buildings and the landscape merit re-examination on intensive survey forms. And since the buildings are of such scale and importance, we're suggesting 100% survey of all the buildings on the campus. And a current eligibility analysis should be prepared using accepted National Register standards, as well as an adequate historic context. I think the historic context in their report for Trinidad State was something like 2 or 3 pages. It covered all the community colleges and vocational colleges, so it didn't just look at Trinidad State. And the new study would also assess the significance of architects and builders, which the previous survey did not do at all. So, next slide. As Erica noted, we assessed 2 areas as moderate survey for future survey. The Taylor and Robinson addition in the north is one of those. And this is essentially the southern part of the Taylor and Robinson addition. We felt that the more northern part, north of Godding, was not, had a much more, displayed many more alterations and a greater mix of more recent construction. The area is overwhelmingly residential, encompassing frame, brick, and stone dwellings in a variety of architectural styles and building types, including Victorian, American movements, classic cottage, bungalow, Dutch colonial revival, craftsman, foursquare, and Edwardian. So it's quite a mix of different housing styles. Next. Most of the buildings date to the early 20th century, about 78%, built between 1900 and 1929. San Pedro Avenue on the east features brick paving, which adds interest. The potential survey area does include clusters of post-World War II construction and non-contributing elements, but retains sufficient historic integrity to warrant survey. That's essentially why it's assessed as being moderate rather than high. It also includes 2 potentially significant non-residential buildings, City Fire Station number 2 on Nevada Avenue, and this corner brick commercial building on San Pedro Avenue. Again, given the relatively long period of intense construction and diversity of architectural styles and building forms, we're again recommending a 2080 mix of reconnaissance, or intensive to reconnaissance survey forms. Next.
And I'll speak to our last moderate priority for survey area. This is the Fisher's Peak subdivision. It has 47 parcels that were built between 1951 and 1988, but the vast majority of these date from the 1950s and 60s. The windshield surveys indicated this small subdivision has a good collection of mid-century residential architecture, reflecting common forms of the period, namely low slung branches and strip malls. Several display modern movement styling, such as dramatically pitched asymmetrical roofs. And the historic integrity of the area appears to be high. Due to these findings, we are recommending Fisher's Peak as a moderate priority for survey so that this area of Trinidad's later residential architecture post-World War II can be documented and evaluated for possible preservation efforts. Due to the apparent high integrity, small parcel total, short construction period, and relative lack of variety between the house forms and styles, we recommend surveying the area with a typical 10 to 90 ratio intensive to reconnaissance level survey, which should adequately capture the addition's developmental history and architectural variety for effective preservation evaluation.
And Lori, my wife, who also participated in the project, wanted to make sure we kind of address the areas evaluated as low priority. And those are some of the reasons why we should not, write them off as not being important. They were primarily assessed as low priority due to the lack of historic integrity. They displayed greater alterations, additions, and new construction. Each of these areas is discussed in the report with the reasons why we classified them the way we did. Essentially, these evaluations reflect the perspective and requirements of historic preservation, which give greater priority to the areas that retain historic integrity, mural alterations, and non-historic infill. Again, it's not to imply the low priorities are unimportant. Every building has a story to tell, and older areas with more alterations to building stock may have richer history. Lori's been doing a lot of work in Denver, and she's found that that's especially true we live in the Northwest area, and it's kind of important to not lose these stories, because it's amazing how quickly, once a building is torn down, it's totally forgotten. In fact, people have difficulty remembering what was on that corner until just a few months ago. In addition, neighborhoods and historic buildings play a critical role in environmental sustainability, representing the reservoirs of embodied energy by the materials and labor consumed in their initial construction. Former president of the American Institute of Architects pointed out the greenest building is the one that is already built. Similarly, smaller, older homes may also provide more affordable housing options for families starting out and older residents with more limited spatial needs or fixed incomes. Next. To partially address the fact that some of these areas are not recommended for intensive survey, we also looked at potential individual buildings that might be surveyed in a scattered, a selective intensive survey of different areas of the city. And then we did identify about 63 resources that might be included, and a number of these are in those low priority areas. Others, of course, are scattered throughout the higher priority areas that would be picked up in the surveys that we're recommending for those. Next. In closing, I'll say it's always a treat for architectural historians to come to Trinidad, because there's so many significant buildings. Every time you turn a corner, you see something interesting architecturally and in all different parts of the city. I think it reflects the fact that it once had your city once had a much larger population, so you have a larger building stock than you would expect for a city of your current population. And Trinidad has a deep and rich history, from the Santa Fe Trail, the wool industry, railroading, coal mining, now to recreational marijuana. The history has embraced many different ethnic groups, including Hispanos, Italians, Eastern Europeans, and a large Jewish population that gave the city Temple Erin. Joanne West Dodds wrote a book called The Alchemy of Pueblo, but that could be said of Trinidad as well. And we look forward to receiving your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Victor, if we can open it up, if there's any questions from anyone. If anyone has any questions, just unmute your mic and feel free to ask Tom or Erica any specific questions.
Sure, I have a question. My name is Sally Jane, and I was wondering if when you all did the historic evaluation of the different neighborhoods, did you ever go underneath the pavement to look for brick streets? Because I know that a lot of times when there have been excavations done in the other historic neighborhoods, they will pull up pavement to find that the brick streets were just paved over. So like, for example, downtown Main Street, there are areas where when they've had to excavate, they've pulled up brick. And I was wondering if you all ever thought of that, or if you ever assessed it.
Well, this was a windshield survey, so we didn't really do that intensive a look. I know here in Denver, I mean, when they do street repairs in certain areas, they often encounter old trolley rails when they're doing projects of that sort. I have not seen a. There are maps that show the current extent of the brick street. I'm not aware of one that shows the maximum extent of the brick streets of Trinidad. But our report does have several resources that talk about the importance of brick streets and the maintenance and repair of them that we include in a footnote. Erica, do you want to?
I don't think I have anything to add. Unfortunately, kind of that deeper look was beyond the purview of what we were able to do with this project. But as Tom noted, we definitely reference the importance of brick streets, the ones that are visible today, but even possible ones that are still in existence but just covered over. The importance of those brick streets to the historic character of that neighborhood.
And I would point out too that we did solicit comment from other consultants and city staff, other CLGs, just to try to assess how many brick streets there are in Colorado, and there are very few examples. See a lot of brick streets in Kansas cities, Edson, Kansas, Oberlin, cities of that sort, but I know in Denver there are a few little pieces of brick streets still extant, but nothing like Trinidad, and we really couldn't find any other cities that displayed such a impressive system of brick streets.
I had a question. I'm Erin on City Council. I wanted to ask Georgie, right now when somebody is proposing a modification to a building that's a contributing structure, what happens with regard to that? Does HPC comment at this point or have any input?
We really don't have any input. In the in our municipal code, chapter 14, the historic zone district, there is a regulation that if a building if an application for a demo permit is submitted, that the owner needs to provide an engineer's report that the building is unstable and unrepairable. I don't think we've had a lot of cooperation from the public as a whole in that regard. So I believe that's a lot of the reason that Tom and Erica have recommended establishing design guidelines that would be a little bit more restrictive in the district, but it would also protect the district for the long term.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I thought we did have design guidelines in the district.
They're very basic. It's using similar materials, like with the new Galleria building. We had worked with them to ensure that was a brick building, similar type materials, but it's very minimum requirements in the district this time. So, since you were on the commission, so we've really tried to build, educating the community and trying to lead with a carrot approach, and kind of influence people's decisions. So I think it's a process. You have to get the community behind supporting that.
And then I had a question for Erica or Lori. Did you in the report specify how you would recommend reducing the boundary? Did you give any kind of a specific indication of what buildings would be out of it?
No, we did not. I mean, that's something that a survey effort would have to do. I'm not sure if it'd be so many. I don't think that we would be thinking of removing any historic buildings from the district, but maybe contracting the boundary on the north that have now been filled in with parks and other types of resources, and areas where it would appear that more development would be likely to occur. but that, but basically you have to do a survey of some sort. I don't know if it would be I think those forms are done in 2002 for the buildings that we covered are pretty detailed. So I don't think I would want to recommend doing expensive 1403 forms for everything, but picking up the buildings that haven't been surveyed and doing some type of data collection survey form, maybe a hybrid version of the recon form, to do an assessment that would make an assessment of contributing, non-contributing, that would reflect an expanded period of significance. And I think that would be a very useful thing to do. And Erica, if you have any thoughts on
yeah, I think I would just add that essentially using those very detailed survey forms that were already completed in the early 2000s as a baseline and kind of revisiting what they look like today, and then using that information to kind of reevaluate and assess what boundaries should be, especially at that moment.
Okay. And then I just wanted to mention I'm on the Trinidad State Advisory Commission, and I'll be happy to pass this along to Dr. Epper and let her know that that's something that you're recommending be done with regard to the college. And last, I just wanted to thank Georgie for all the work that she's been doing. And I remember when we were talking about doing this very thing, that Georgie was really encouraging us to do it. And I can see now the real value to it. I really appreciated everything that you put in there, and just reading the history of all these residential areas it makes you understand their value better. So good job. Thank you. Thanks for allowing us to sit in on it.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. Jean Delicia, I'm on the Historical Preservation Commission. I was on it when Erin was on it. How are you doing, Erin? Thought about the things you brought up between the comparison of the 2001 and what was reduced, what buildings were reduced along Commercial and Main that really were demolished, and how we can preserve more of that Corazon district. Some of them were all, and some of them were demolished. So
yeah,
we really need to have the council aware of what those very historical on the Corazon district that shouldn't be tampered with, don't you think? Or I don't know if it's in your survey, if you showed what buildings were demolished and what buildings were previously in the 2000, just in our last 20 years.
Yeah, we did. We did call those out, and I have to say, when Laura and I drove up North Commercial in March, we were pretty shocked when we got to that 200 block. The Sister Blandina Park construction, I think, took out 2 contributing buildings. The whole Toyota dealership area, which I'm sure is a big economic driver, but it sure would have been nice if that had been someplace else rather than in the middle of a National Register Historic District. But we do list the ones that we noted had been demolished, and also we noted the new construction in those areas, especially the north, the International Bank, the bank, I think Bank of the West, is it? So there's definitely some things that, from a purely historic preservation point of view, in terms of maintaining a strong National Register district, you wouldn't really want to see. So that is a reason for retracting the district on the north, I think, because it seems apparent that more development may well be occurring. So it might be better to define a smaller district and then try to get some better design guidelines, review any changes within that district.
So we can have different design guidelines for different districts? Is that what you're recommending too?
Well, it would be one National Register Historic District, but in other cities, if there are different historic districts, it is possible to have different design guidelines. I'm not suggesting two different districts for downtown, but
I understood that. Thank you.
I'll just add to that too that this is another reason why reevaluating the period of significance for the district is important, because I think there's a lot of, right now there's this category of contributing and non-contributing, but there's a lot of buildings that are considered non-contributing by that National Register listing that I think the community would feel their loss if they were removed. And so reassessing what's contributing, non-contributing based on a more expansive period of significance that really does reflect the true development of the core zone and not just this tighter to 1924 timeframe, I think will be an important step as far as that goes too.
And Eric, could you kind of address the impact that might have on a tax credit project? I mean, it's like I said, it's not an academic question. It really impacts the hassle that it creates for people trying to rehabilitate some buildings.
Right. Yeah. So, I previously worked for the state and in the National Register program, and this was a common thing that we would have questions from property owners in Trinidad especially, but other communities have this issue at times too, but Trinidad was definitely a big one where owners of what we would consider historic buildings that would be eligible for the National Register on their own individually were considered non-contributing as far as the district listing goes. And it meant that there was a lot of hoops that owner had to go through to prove that they were eligible for historic tax credits to help fund rehabilitation projects, preservation projects. And, that's kind of the last thing we want is more hurdles for owners of historic buildings, especially when their next door neighbor who happens to fit into this tighter time frame doesn't have to go through those hoops. So, yeah, it does create more of a barrier. That doesn't mean they can't ever get tax credits, but it just makes it that much more difficult. It's not something that historic districts need.
So, Eric and Tom, would this be like one process if we made the decision to revise the boundary and extend the period of significance? That would be just one project that done all at once.
Correct.
Yes.
I think it would be a real benefit to property owners to be, some of the buildings built in the 1930s and 40s that could very easily be eligible for tax credits.
Yeah.
And the local landmarking program was really meant to make an easier process for people to get that recognition and be able to apply for the tax credit. So I think that's a very good suggestion.
Maybe I could ask, I haven't discussed this with Erica, but I'll just pose a question to her. In terms of doing a revised National Register nomination, would that essentially be additional documentation, and how would you assess the level of difficulty, I guess, for doing something like that?
Well, I think in the end it probably would need to be almost an entirely new nomination, just because of the paucity of the 1973 information. However, as we talked about before, the 2001-2002 survey really does provide most of the information needed to, and is an incredibly important head start on doing something like that. But again, that information could then be kind of reevaluated today based on existing conditions to both look at what the period of significance should be and what the boundary should be. But I just want to point out that National Register nominations and other types of nominations, I think a lot of people think of them as a document that just makes the case of why it should be historically designated. But it's important to think of them also as planning documents for once designation is achieved, how do we know what is important about this area or this building? And if it has adequate documentation, that document becomes an incredible tool to make those preservation decisions. So just wanted to put that out there, that the National Register nomination, unfortunately, that's kind of why the 73 document falls short, because it really doesn't, it can't really be used as a planning document, as something to reference in the future, other than kind of overview of the district. So having a new nomination that meets those documentation expectations that we have today would make it an important tool for the Preservation Commission and for owners and for the city in general, to just understand what we're talking about as far as the district, but also individual governments.
And I would say too that it's not like, for the era, it's not a horrible nomination. I mean, that was sort of the level of documentation that was expected of National Register district nominations to that point. But I would also point out that, you know, doing a new nomination, you would have to build public support and owner support for that, because essentially it has to, a majority of owners can't oppose a district nomination, and frankly, you'd really want, you know, a good level of support. You know, 75% would be nice, you know, or more. But you know.
Sorry, I'll just jump in. That actually, as an established district, unless new properties were being added, new kind of owner objection, it doesn't come into play. That's not to say that community support and engagement is still very important, but it isn't actually going to become an issue as far as getting the district. It's already listed, it's just kind of changing or adding to its documentation, refining it. And so that doesn't actually open the door for owner objection for the National Register.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. We've never had a situation like that. So that's makes your job a lot easier.
I also just wanted to jump in. I know Jane had a question about the name of CP Treats Edition, and Georgie answered it that it's CP stands for Charles P. Treat. So it was the name of the essentially the developer who provided the edition. There's a little bit of information in the survey plan about him, the little bit we found.
I have another question. Do you have any idea of the cost involved in doing a new nomination and all the work that has to go into that? Is there any kind of a rough estimate that you could give us?
Not off the top of my head. I think we could probably put something together, but there is a good bit of information, but it would require some actual field work, looking at the buildings and doing some kind of form. That would be something that the city could apply for either a CLG or SHF, State Historical Fund grant to undertake.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm going to jump in here. My name is Elizabeth. I'm a new member of the commission and just have a question on the design guidelines. So I don't think I understand completely if those are separate and apart from a municipal code sort of requirement, or how does that actually work, and how are they drafted and where do they live?
I guess the design guidelines, we were speaking basically of the core zone district. So establishing design guidelines for that district would regulate the exterior, any changes to the exterior of the building, the interior is not considered. It's just the exterior facades of the building. So if someone wanted to take out historic windows and replace them with double pane windows, they would have to come to the commission if the guidelines were in place. Things like that, they would have to come to the commission and get
Okay,
approved.
I'm just trying to understand what what a guideline is. In other words, is it, as the name suggests, so it's just basically these are based on, I'm sure some other standards, or is it part of the municipal code, or is it outside of a code? And how are they enforced? That's my other question. So I'm just learning. Thank you.
Maybe Tom and Erica can explain a little bit more about design guidelines.
Well, we don't prepare design guidelines, but generally if you have design guidelines in place, they could apply to changes to existing buildings. Generally, like in Denver, I think it's anything that requires and Erin can she's on the Landmark Commission here, so she can provide some input on that. But any exterior changes that require a building permit would, in a district, would go to the Landmark Commission. It could also provide standards for new construction in terms of scale, setback, materials, massing, things of that sort. Generally, often they reference the Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic buildings, and that would be things like replacing, keeping as much historic fabric as possible, and using in-kind materials where that isn't possible.
I would just add that the design guidelines kind of expand upon the Secretary of Interior standards of reference. Those are 10 standards. They're very broad, and they're not meant to be prescriptive. They kind of don't get into like the nitty-gritty details. And so, for example, design guidelines might provide further guidance when it comes to roofs. When roofs are being changed, what is appropriate and what is not appropriate? And sometimes that's not just material, but is it changing dormers? Is it adding dormers? When is that okay, or is it not okay? Again, the guidelines, and so it's guidance, but it's meant to kind of drill down a little bit further from those interior standards to provide a little bit more guidance both to the commission members and to applicants looking to do their projects. And this is why sometimes there can be citywide design guidelines that apply to any and all projects that are under the purview of the commission citywide. But they can also be more specific to a particular neighborhood based on that neighborhood's characteristics or development patterns, et cetera. So it just kind of gives a little bit more specific guidance on how to consider what is appropriate or not. How that ties into the municipal code, honestly, is a little beyond me. I think it depends on how the municipal code lays out. Like, does it require the commission to use them? I think typically that is the case, that they're adopted as official documents that the commission relies upon in their decisions. But it just kind of varies depending on the legal framework on how the city is set up its resolution.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful.
And the enforcement mechanism might well be a denial of if someone is proposing to do something to a historic building that doesn't comport with the design guidelines, then the building permit would not be issued. That would be sort of the enforcement mechanism.
And under our situation, I think, adoption of guidelines would be a decision of the council.
I had one more question following up on that. If we followed your advice to consider creating other historic districts throughout the city in residential areas, would there then also be contributing structures within those areas that would be limited in how they could be altered?
Well, first of all, you're going down the road a few miles there. The first thing would be, you'd have to do a survey. We don't know if they're historic districts. We think that these have good integrity, and there might be the potential for a historic district. But that's essentially what a survey would do. Would be to do that analysis and propose a boundary. And and for a historic district, there would be contributing, non-contributing buildings within those areas if a district were established, either a local district or a National Register district.
Okay. Like Georgie, I'm thinking through, kind of public ideas about all of these things and what might be some pushback with regard to that. That's why I'm looking ahead to see if we did that. Are we going to have people saying, well, I can't do what I was going to do to my house? So that's always a tension, I'm sure.
Yeah, the more we can educate the community, the much more likely we'd be able to succeed in those things. But I'm hoping that the plan will make the community aware of the individual properties that could easily be locally landmarked and create more interest in that. And of course, our landmark program, once someone does that, then they do agree to maintain the house in a manner that's acceptable with the commission. So.
Yeah, I think that always helps where you have some kind of early adopters that are willing to proceed with landmark a local landmark designation, and it reassures other people to say it's not a horrible thing, and it's not a huge hassle, and I think I might want to look into that too. And I would say too, that list of 63 or so buildings that we included, we're not saying those are necessarily landmark ready. I mean, you would have to do some research and into the history and potential alterations and what criteria they might meet, either local or National Register requirements.
And Erin, I'm really glad to hear you're on the board there at the college, because I think that's a really neat thing to consider. The different time frames that those buildings were put up, and they're all contained there. It was just a special thing. So.
And I think that Dr. Epper and our team would be encouraged that's a potential thing that the college could do.
That's great. So, did anyone else have any other questions that they wanted to ask Tom or Erica? Well, I just wanted to thank you both, because there's a number of things in the plan that opened my eyes. I'm trying to learn as quickly as I can about this program, historic preservation, and there are a number of things that my eyes were open to. So I think it'll be really beneficial for the commission to give them some guidance as where we go next, our next steps. So I really appreciate all your efforts on this. And
it was a really enjoyable project.
It's great. So
Yes, thank you both.
Thank you all. And thank you for attending the meeting tonight. I really do appreciate it. Okay. Okay. Thank you all. All right.
Thank you.